George Floyd's death has triggered a nationwide call for police reform. In more than 2 weeks since, most demonstrations have been peaceful, but some cities around the country have seen protests turn violent with rioting and looting. In his latest column for the New York Times, Jamelle Bouie believes we should start talking about how the police are directly responsible for some of the rioting. He even feels some cops have done more to stoke violence on the streets than to quell it. Jamelle joins me now. He is a New York Times opinion columnist. Jamelle, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us. It's great to have you with us. You offer a very interesting perspective in your column. You know, of particular note, you write about the fact that these rioting protesters can be held to account for the destruction and violence, but the rioting police, because they are, you know, officially extensions of the state, sort of have the stamp of approval, the official stamp of approval of the state. Can you expand on that?
Sure. This gets to sort of the issue of police violence and police abuse in general. Oftentimes, when you talk about this, there is a response that why don't you care about, say, other causes of death or disadvantage among African Americans or any other group that faces disproportionate abuse from the police. But the thing about the police is that they are arms of the state. They are supposed to be working in defense of, for the people of the country, of the community, or what have you. And so when you're comparing, in the case of riots or disruption or civil unrest, the behavior of individual citizens and police, I think you do have to have two different standards. And I don't think that the police who have been responsible for real disorder on the streets, whether that's indiscriminate use of tear gas and pepper spray, shooting rubber bullets at journalists, using military gear against peaceful protesters, and thus sort of creating the kind of agitation and fear that lead to unrest. I think we have to look at police and hold them to a much higher standard than we do ordinary citizens.
And is that almost a legal standard? Because you can argue, you could take that argument a little further and say, you know, if these police, like in the case of the riot police that pepper sprayed the protesters in front of St. James Church, you know, if you can prove that this was sort of an illegal or an extreme use of force for peaceful protesters who are just exercising their constitutional rights, then you could argue that they have in fact broken the law.
I think that's an argument you could make. The part of the problem, right, is that police officers, police departments get a wide range of legal protections, and so it's sort of very difficult to prove that the law has been broken. But I think if we look at this from a political standpoint and just think of this as, if we can't hold, you know, a department legally accountable, then how do we hold it politically accountable? I think we have to take seriously the idea that the methods that the police are using for crowd control are almost designed to stoke more unrest. One of my most vivid memories is from being in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014 during the protest over the killing of Michael Brown, and seeing in real time how just the presence of militarized police officers changes the dynamic of a confrontation, or rather it turns a meeting between police and protesters into a confrontation between police and protesters. And I think if you sort of see both the instances over the past 3 weeks where there has been unrest, and then the instance over the past 3 weeks where there has been peaceful protests, one of the key differences, one of the things that sort of changes one to the other, is how the police themselves are behaving. And if the police are not behaving as if the protesters are a threat, as if they are some people to be controlled, then you have much better outcomes for everyone.
You make such a good point, because we have seen images of those protests where police officers have joined the protesters, or, you know, taken a knee, or even in some cases hugged the protesters. And I don't know this for a fact, but I would imagine that those particular protests did not veer into the same kind of violence that we're talking about here.
I think that's right. And then the other piece of this is that I don't think we should simply, I don't think we can turn a blind eye to the fact that we have, and before the segment started, we saw the video from Buffalo, police sort of just acting violently, right? acting violently without provocation, using extreme force against peaceful protesters. I think that is, the extent to which that is a common thread across the country, for me, and I argued this in my column, represents the extent to which I think many police are just rejecting the idea that there ought to be any limits on how they act vis-a-vis the public.
All right, I want to switch gears now to another column you wrote in the New York Times where you argue President Trump thinks that he is this year's law and order candidate, but actually you say he's not. Remind us why the president wants to take on this mantra and what makes you believe he's not the law and order candidate that he claims he is.
Well, in his 2016 campaign, he presented himself as this kind of avatar of law and order, that he would bring calm to the streets. There were protests that year as well. In his inaugural address, he promised an end to American carnage and presented himself again as this figure of order. And it's clear that he wants to do that again. To the extent that he's commented on what's happened across the country, his tweets, his statements have all been about bringing order to the situation. But the problem is that it's much easier to be a law and order candidate when you're not the person in power, when you can say that electing you, bringing you in, would restore order. But if you are actually the incumbent, then it's very difficult to make the claim to law and order, because the disorder is actually happening on your watch. If you could bring order, then presumably you would have brought order.
And just quickly, because in that same column, you touch on similarities and differences between today and 1968, when, Richard Nixon won the presidency on a law and order platform over the 1968 riots. You believe these two campaigns are actually quite different and that this president won't be able to ride to the White House on that same type of platform. Is that right?
That's right. Setting aside the riots, 1968 had sort of a variety of different kinds of political disruption. We had the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy. We had the Vietnam War was ongoing and was the source of much unrest. The Democratic Party was basically falling apart by that fall. And so Nixon didn't just have this law and order platform. He could count on sort of external events helping him bolster the claim that under Democratic control of government, America has fallen into disorder, and electing him would help bring order. And again, for Trump, it's the situation is reversed, right? That the disorder facing the United States is very much under his watch. And so it would be almost something of an own goal, right? To say that, oh, I'm going to bring law and order because the country is out of control. Well, you are currently the incumbent. I think that if you're making historical parallels, and in that column, I caution people against trying to substitute these parallels and analogy for thinking through the situation at hand, because things are very different than they were in 1968. But if you were going to try to continue along those lines, the closest analog to someone like Nixon, who is a longtime Washington figure, vice president under a beloved former president, someone who very much represented the establishment, it would probably be Biden. He kind of fits that those characteristics